for more on the Climate Change Conference. I'm joined by Paul Bledsoe here in the studio. He's the president of Bledsoe Associates and a senior fellow for the Climate Change and Energy Program at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Elaine.
I know that you were on your way to Peru. You told me that just a few minutes ago. There are close to 200 countries gathering there. Do you think a deal is realistic, that something can be worked through so it can be signed in Paris next year?
I think we've got a good foundation for a deal with the announcements by the European Union, the United States, and China. It's important to note, however, there's a lot of wiggle room in those big three announcements. It really will be helpful if China can actually cap its emissions by 2025 instead of 2030. That's critical. It's important that the U.S. meet the high end of its target, and that the Europeans and the U.S. come up with more money for finance for developing countries too. So I'm optimistic. It is important that the Canadians, the Australians, South Africans, Russians, Brazilians, Indonesians, and many other countries begin to make pledges as well to keep this momentum.
And we did hear that in the story. Do you think with China and the United States announcing that major agreement capping the emissions, do you see it, one, having a huge influence over what's taking place there in Lima? And do you see it holding up over time? Because 2025, 2030 is a ways down the road. Can it hold up?
I believe that this issue has now reached the head of state platform where major nations are deeply concerned about their own economies, securities, their agricultural production, their coastlines. This has become a national security and economic issue for the world and for its heads of state. So I actually believe that the U.S., China, and other major nations are going to be able to deliver on their commitments if the populations, businesses, and others keep the pressure on. One thing that's important to recognize, however, is there's a pretty profound north-south divide on climate change. The north of the world has caused the problem with industrialized countries, including China now. Chinese historic emissions will pass U.S. emissions by the end of this decade. The south of the world, the poorer developing countries, have not caused this problem, and yet they're going to be the ones who are on the front line of climate change impacts. I think the one issue that might still derail a big deal in Paris is developing countries saying we're not getting enough support to decarbonize our economies, to grow like the wealthier countries are growing, and to protect our countries from the worst of climate change impacts. This is an issue called loss and damage that dozens of developing countries are very concerned about. So if I were looking for one issue that might derail this apple cart, that's the one.
Even if some sweeping changes are agreed upon and something is worked through, is climate change still happening at a much faster rate than what can be implemented by all of these nations?
Climate change is a marathon, not a sprint. We are going to be dealing with the effects of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for decades and probably centuries. It's just going to be a reality of modern life. However, if we cut emissions quickly, especially over the next 2 or 3 decades, we can prevent the worst impacts, irreversible impacts that would truly change the climatology of places around the globe, displace populations, cause major crop failures, cause inundation in sea level, water supply problems. I mean, these are really biblical, epic problems that could arise from climate change if we don't cut emissions over the next few years and decades. If we do, I'm hopeful we can deal with this problem, but we are going to be living with it for decades to come.
All right, Paul Bledsoe, we'd like to see what your thoughts are when you get back. If you thought it was a success, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate it. Thanks.